All right, with me today, making his return to this program, is the founder of DonorSee, an incredible app that allows people to directly support charitable causes and see the results in real time. And Lions of Liberty listeners even helped to build a house for a homeless woman in Malawi last year. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. I am so pleased to welcome back the one and only Gret Glyer. Gret, are you ready to roar?
Oh, yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, Gretton, I know I've been a big fan of your work ever since I first discovered the DonorSee app, and I know so many Lions of Liberty listeners love using the app as well. People are always sharing different projects. We actually had one of our big supporters, one of our Patreon supporters, Clint Rankin, develop this whole group called Walk the Walk, specifically for the purpose of gathering different libertarian podcasters and podcasters in general to support various causes through DonorSee. So for some people that might be new to the show, that might somehow by now be unfamiliar with your work, why don't you do a quick little summary of what exactly is DonorSee, how does it work, and what differentiates it from your standard charitable organization?
Gotcha. Well, I'll make my answer specific to the libertarian crowd since that's who I'm addressing today. So the general idea behind DonorSee is that it's a way for donors to see where their money goes when they donate through video documentation. So like for example, when your listeners donated a house, by the way, I think they funded it in a matter of a few hours. I was blown away by that.
I was blown away as well. Everyone really rallied around that. It was incredible.
So that was a really cool thing. And what happened was everyone who donated the house, they were able to get picture and video updates of the house as it was being built, and then the completed house, and they got to see the lady be moved into it. So everyone who donated got updates to their phone and to their emails showing with video documentation exactly what happened.
Yeah, I believe she even specifically thanked Lions of Liberty listeners. So you get a very personal connection with the people that you're helping, as opposed to when you send your money to some of the major charitable organizations out there. All you know is that you sent them money. Basically, you don't know anything else about who actually got help by it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is one of the main differentiators. Is it's really hard. Like if you donate $25 to a brand name charity of some kind, probably like good work is happening with that. But at the same time, you have no idea how that $25 is being applied. In general, it's like really hard to trace that money. With DonorSee, it's very easy. You give money to specific things, and then you get feedback on those specific things.
How does the overhead of supporting DonorSee causes work as compared to those major charitable organizations? What kind of numbers have you been able to sort of sort out in the last couple of years about how sort of, I guess, efficiently the money that gets sent through DonorSee is used compared to those major organizations?
Right. So we compare ourselves both to major organizations, and then we compare ourselves to people who are like doing just regular crowdfunding. So major organizations, a lot of times they're in the 10 to 20% range in terms of how much they're taking, or sometimes it's way steeper, unfortunately, 40 to 60%. But let's just say around 15% is kind of normal for a big charity. And then you have folks like GoFundMe and Kickstarter, and they're taking about 5% per transaction. And then we've got DonorSee, which on average, it's a fluctuating amount depending on like what form of payment they use and stuff. But on average, the percentage that we take per transaction is 3.75%. So a really large amount of your money is going to help the actual people in need. And the money that those razor thin margins that we take, that goes to helping us build the app and the website and helping us keep everyone accountable.
One question I get a lot from people about the DonorSee app is, are these donations tax deductible? I know that they're not. Can you explain why that is, why the organization is set up in a sort of a different way, and why that actually benefits your ability to sort of help people out there?
Absolutely. So I think that's a fair question that people ask. I actually started a tax-deductible 501c3 organization back when I lived in Malawi, Africa, where I lived for 3 years. And the idea behind that organization was to build houses for orphans and widows. One of the things I noticed was as we grew, the regulations to keep our tax deduction status kept getting steeper and steeper and steeper. And so if we were to grow really large, we would be put into a situation where we'd be forced to spend lots of money on accountants and lawyers and less money going to the poor. And so by keeping ourselves non-tax deductible, the money is able to travel faster and more efficiently to those who are in need.
You would effectively be forced to become more like those large organizations, those much less efficient organizations, which really runs counter to the whole reason that DonorSee exists in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. And there might be a possibility someday where we could offer a type of tax deduction through organizations that we partner with, but that's just not a priority for us. Right now, the priority is building the relationships between the donors and the recipients. And we might at some point be able to do something like that. But again, we want to make sure that we're focusing on helping people as opposed to being really good at filling out paperwork.
You guys also launched an investment opportunity with DonorSee earlier this year. I know through the WeFunder website. Can you give an update on that, and also, how people can actually invest in DonorSee if they really are that passionate about what you guys are doing?
Absolutely. So WeFunder is a website that's kind of like Kickstarter, but for startups. So the way that WeFunder works is people invest certain amounts of money, and usually on like Kickstarter, you would get an album or something like that. On WeFunder, you get equity in a company. So because we're set up as an LLC, we're able to offer an equity stake in our company to those who invest. And then the idea is sometime down the line, maybe we'll sell DonorSee to a larger organization. Maybe DonorSee will have a public exit of some kind. Then you would financially benefit if something like that were to happen. But it's also a way to just support the mission of what we're doing. If you believe in supporting if you believe in sending funds directly to people, if you like the decentralized model that we use, this is a great way that you can support us, because all of this money, none of this, I take a salary of $0 a year. My team is paid, and we make sure that they get paid and they're paid fairly and so forth, but I don't take anything out of it. I just support myself through Patreon. And so if you're mission minded and you want to help the organization through these efforts, all of that money is going to optimizing our platform and helping us get the word out.
Oh, Gret, I got to ask then. I also take a $0 salary per year from Lions of Liberty, but I have a full-time job as well. So how do you do it? How do you live putting so much time and effort into this organization without taking a dime from it?
Yeah, the way I do it is, so I have a Patreon, so people can go to patreon.com/Gret Glyer, and that's really the idea behind how I'm going to support myself. I'm not fully funded yet, but I'm actually farther along. I'm grateful to be as far along as I am in terms of how much I've been funding, and I'm trying to raise a little bit more in that regards. And the reason that we do it that way is just so how I'm personally and financially benefiting from this is completely out in the open. Like, I want people to see, like, we don't hide any of the Patreon numbers like you're allowed to do. Like, everything is fully out there so people can see exactly how I'm benefiting from running this platform. And I put in way more hours than I financially benefit, but I'm happy to do it. I love doing this. Like, every day I get to see people's lives being changed on this platform, and that's quite a reward in and of itself.
It really is sort of a model of individual voluntary charity, not just the way DonorSee works, but also the way you maintain income.
Exactly.
You don't take it from DonorSee. You say, if you like the work I'm doing here, please voluntarily decide to support me, Gret Glyer, so I can continue to do that kind of work. It's really a shining example for the voluntary society that so many libertarians advocate for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that's the idea. Is it the idea of having me be supported through Patreon was a very natural fit with how we're already running things. So yeah, it really made a lot of sense.
Now, Gret, I brought you back on today because you wanted to, you were looking for some podcasts to go on because you really wanted to talk about the subject of wealth inequality. And as I was telling you before the show, I went into this intentionally blind. I tried to avoid any other videos or writing you had done about this subject because I just wanted to go in with a clean slate, because I know that you're going to have a unique view on the subject either way. And I would say in general, when you talk to people, at least a lot of the people I run into out here in California, most people have a very generic view of wealth inequality. Something along the lines of, greedy capitalists basically hoard wealth, and that's why so many people are poor. And that's why we have the 1%. And then we have basically everybody else. And obviously the everybody else is a different in perspective depending on where you live. The poor here in America are doing much better than the poor in Malawi, or even the wealthy in Malawi. So it's all very relative. But like I said, I'm going with a clean slate. So what is your view on wealth inequality as in relation to how it may differentiate from that standard view I sort of laid out that so many seem to hold?
Sure. Yeah. So just to put everyone's initial concerns to rest, I don't think if people say that wealth inequality is getting worse, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? A lot of times, especially if from kind of the Oxfam crowd, the folks who are well, I'll put it this way. A lot of times, people, like you said, people are saying that wealth inequality is at an all-time high, and therefore that's bad. Like the worse that wealth inequality is, the worse off people are. I don't agree with that. Obviously, like on every empirical level, the world is getting so much better in so many different ways, and the level of wealth inequality, like sure, like the richest people are way richer than the poorest people, like never before. But also the poorest people are wealthier than the previous poorest people like never before. And so I don't think wealth inequality in and of it's too vague of a subject. In and of itself, it's not a bad thing. One of the things that I do think needs more attention, and I've been grateful that the libertarian community seems to acknowledge this and has come around this. And this is the reason, one of the reasons I'm going on these different podcasts is because I started my own podcast just a couple months ago, and I'm talking about these subjects all the time. Like the entire reason behind the podcast and behind DonorSee and behind working with the libertarian community is because I think that one of the things that's under-discussed in our society in general is global poverty. I think that sure, wealth inequality might not be a bad thing in and of itself, but I also think there's a steep level of ignorance about just the level of poverty in the world. And I'm hoping to start a conversation about that.
So why is there so much poverty in the world? What differentiates, say, a country like the United States, like we said, where even the poorest people, I walk around Los Angeles and see a lot of homeless people that are poor, but, a lot of them have bicycles and cell phones and, are probably doing better than a lot of the people who are just working full-time jobs or the equivalent of maybe a full-time job in a country like Malawi. What are the conditions that create sort of poverty in a country as compared to somewhere like the United States?
Right. So poverty is just the norm all across the board. Like the normal thing is that people are poor and they have been poor for a really long time. And when I say poor, you might have this idea of someone who's living in an inner city situation and they maybe don't have as nice of stores around them, or they don't have like a nice CVS that they can go to or whatever, but they still have lots of amenities. But when I'm talking about the level of poverty that both exists in our world right now and that has existed for a long time, I'm referring to people who live on $1 a day or maybe $2 a day. People who if they had a $20 expense, they couldn't afford it. When I was living in Malawi, which has been ranked as the poorest country in the world most frequently in the last 5 years, I found out that there were situations where people couldn't afford a $20 hospital bill. Like they couldn't afford the $20 it took to go to the hospital. And so they just continue to suffer. Like that was just their reality. And so as like what you were asking, what are the conditions that create wealth versus poverty? I think that there are several things. I think one of the things that is undeniable is that capitalism has done more to lift people out of poverty than anything else by far. And then the question becomes, okay, well, now we're in a wealthy situation. Now we're creating more wealth. And then what do we do from here? But as a framework, as a starter, capitalism is a huge way to help the poor.
And capitalism, that word can often be seen as a dirty word, especially by a lot of the people who are often raising the red flag about wealth inequality or global poverty, even and that sort of thing. Can you explain, I guess, like how would you approach people that say aren't libertarians, I guess, on this subject? People that are very skeptical of the idea of capitalism, that really associate it more with what you and I might call crony capitalism, with the state sort of helping corporations to sort of corner the market in certain areas. How would you describe to someone of that worldview why capitalism, real capitalism, or what we might call real capitalism from the libertarian perspective, how that actually helps poor people and creates more wealth?
Right. So I think there's a lot of tricky defining terms with what we're doing. Right. So when people hear the word capitalism, a lot of times it immediately triggers this idea of greediness, like someone who's capitalistic supposedly wants a bunch of money for themselves. Really,
I picture the Monopoly man with his monocle just plotting how to
caviar. Yeah, exactly. And I think that the thing is that's a powerful. That sticks with certain people's minds, because there are greedy people out there and they do abuse systems and they do take advantage of people, and that's just, there's no denying it. But the true type of capitalism that when you and I talk about capitalism, the way that I would define it is basically people who are the best at serving other people. So if you create the best cell phone that people love and it makes it easier for them to connect with their friends and stay in touch with their family, you're basically serving a lot of people, and the reward for that, and you're rewarded through a capitalistic system with wealth. And that is something that's very beneficial in society. And like I said, I think that we should, and especially as libertarians, and libertarians are really good at this, I think we should have a conversation about, okay, now we're in this like wealthy society. We've built it. We're continuing to build wealth. What do we do from here? But as a framework, it is very important that people understand that the way, if we're going to see wealth expand in these more impoverished countries, one of the most foundational blocks is that they're able to help themselves through business and entrepreneurship and free markets and capitalism.
You know, a lot of people that are concerned with the subject of inequality, especially in the United States. You know, we saw the Bernie Sanders movement in 2016 attempting to address a lot of these concerns, specifically here in the United States. How would some of these proposals that you hear, just to give some extreme examples, affect people in very, very, very poor countries like Malawi? I mean, let's say if somebody came in and decided, well, you know, people in Malawi are very poor. Clearly, they need to make more money. Why don't we just institute a great minimum wage in Malawi? What would happen if, say, the $15 minimum wage was instituted in a country like Malawi?
Yeah, and so many of these examples are exposed simply by comparing them to countries like Malawi. So the minimum wage is a good example. Another one would be universal health care, right? So there's this idea that everyone has a right to health care, and I wish everyone could have free health care. I think that that'd be a wonderful thing. But at the same time, like, let me ask you this. Like, let's say the people who are living in the States on average make about $56,000 a year. In order to be in the global 1%, the top 1% richest people on the entire planet, you have to make $34,000 a year. So just by being an average American, you're about $20,000 richer than the baseline for being in the 1% of the entire planet. So if you're someone who is petitioning for universal health care and you're saying we need to have universal health care, it's a right. My question is, why doesn't that right apply to the entire planet? And if it does apply to the entire planet, there are people who have like far less than your basic needs right now. Like, why don't we take 90% of everyone's income in the US and give it to people who have no clean water? And that discussion gets shut down very quick because there's absolutely no answer to it. There's no way to fire back at that. So anyways, I think one of the best ways that we can fight some of the, one of the best ways that we can articulate our position against people who are proposing some of these agendas is by talking about global poverty and places like Malawi.
What are the political? I mean, we keep going back to Malawi because I know you lived there for several years. It doesn't need to be specifically about Malawi, but what are the conditions that keep a lot of these countries from becoming more capitalist, from having the same conditions that have developed here in the United States? Despite all the problems, despite all the cronyism, we still have, you know, much more freedom to be sort of capitalist here than many other places in the world. So what exactly, can you get more specific about what the conditions are in countries such as Malawi, other poorer African countries that people just can't seem to get their feet off the ground because of the conditions there?
Right. So one of the things that I think would be nice if it were able to happen more often is if we could, you know, have Malawians kind of speak for themselves. But since I'm here, I'll do my best. Malawi is set up as a democracy. If you ask the local people there how good of a job they do as a democracy, most of them will tell you they do an abysmal job, and a big reason for that is through corruption, and also through things like steep taxes and stuff. But I think the corruption is one of the main hindrances. So there are a lot of people who there are a lot of politicians in Malawi, and there was a scandal that came out in 2013 called Cashgate, where basically the local authorities were pocketing billions of kwacha, the local currency, kwacha that was supposed to go to hospitals and to people in rural villages who were about to enter the hungry season. And so people starved to death and people didn't get medicine because local officials were pocketing money. And so that's the worst of the worst, but at the same time, that's not that uncommon in some of these contexts. So there's technically a democracy set up, but they also have a 50% tax rate on all cars that come into the country. So if you want to buy a $4,000 car, it's going to cost you $6,000 and the government gets $2,000 of that. I mean, there are lots of incentives that prevent wealth from flowing into the country and that prevent the local people there from bringing themselves out of poverty.
So what are some of the real solutions that we could actually propose and implement in a lot of these countries? As you said, maybe inequality isn't a big deal if everyone is getting more wealthy along the way, but how do we address these countries that where there is just so much poverty? Obviously, on the individual level, DonorSee and other people that go to these countries to help people, that's a great thing on the sort of the micro scale, but how can we actually implement changes on the macro level to see some of these countries have the opportunity to really develop in a way the United States did over the last couple hundred years? How can people across the world get the chance to experience the real wealth of capitalism, of true capitalism, and be in a position to really help themselves and their fellow countrymen, fellow villagers, what have you?
Hmm. Well, I'm glad you asked that conversation, or sorry, I'm glad you asked that question, because a lot of times the conversation stops at, well, it's really tough and there's corruption, and well, let's just throw up our hands and not do anything. And by asking that question, you're taking the conversation where it naturally should go, which is, okay, well, what do we do? Like, we're in this position to help. There are people who could use some help. How do we actually take care of that? So I'll give you a general example, and I'll give you a grassroots example, and then I'll give you a more systematic example. The grassroots example, I tell people as much as I can. There's a lady on the DonorSee platform who you're probably familiar with, named Amy Hathaway.
Yep,
Amy
I get emails from her constantly.
Yeah, she has some of
a lot
the
of
most
projects go through her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she's one of our top storytellers. Those are the people who are posting projects on DonorSee, and one of the things that we that Amy does is, first, she saves these babies' lives who are suffering from malnutrition. A lot of times they're on the brink of starvation, and she provides them with formula milk. And unfortunately, these babies often come from they're orphans. Their parents died, or their father ran off, or something like that. And so the baby's just in a very vulnerable position. And what's tough about that is, once the baby's life is saved, we need to do something with the baby. And so what Amy Hathaway does is she sets the baby's caretaker up, the aunt or whoever it is, with a business, and then people can fund the startup expenses for that business. It's often like $300 or something like that to start up an aunt with a business. Once the business is up and running, the aunt is then able to provide formula milk and raise the kid on her own, and even grow her own level of income as time goes on. And then what's crazy is she has an 80% success rate. So for every business that's set up by Amy Hathaway, 4 out of 5 of them are successful, which is crazy for a country like Tanzania. That's crazy that she is able to do that with. Obviously,
it's crazy for a country like the United States. I mean, it's an incredibly high success rate for a business anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And I believe in the U.S. it's something like 1 in 10 businesses succeed or don't die in the first 5 years or something like that. For her, she tracks everything, and 4 to 5 of the businesses are very successful. For the people who aren't successful, she sticks with them. She helps them out a second time, but still, it's like she's doing incredibly impressive work. Okay, so that's a grassroots thing that's going on.
Can we dig into that a little more? I mean, what are some of the reasons that she is able to have such a high success rate with setting people up who, I guess compared to what you might call an education in the United States, are probably very uneducated in many ways. And so how are they able to achieve such success through a very small amount of seed money to run a business and continue it running, like you said, at a much higher rate than even many first world countries?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons behind that. One of them is they're highly incentivized for it to be successful because they really don't have the income. 2 is, there's a lot of studies on this, but for whatever reason, she mostly works through women who are starting these businesses. And for whatever reason, it just seems like women are really good at whatever it is that creates that gets these things up and running. Like, there's a lot of accounting and keeping track of things and being diligent. And for whatever it is, for whatever reason, they're very qualified and they do a good job with that. And I also think this is probably the most crucial thing. A lot of times people think that there's a lot of bad press about charity out there. There's When Helping Hurts, Poverty Inc., Toxic Charity. I mean, like, the list goes on about people who have written and made negative things about charity. And fair enough, there's like a lot of bad stuff that's happened out there. What doesn't get coverage as much is all of the good stuff that's going on. And one of the ways that good things tend to happen, like Amy Hathaway's business setups that she does, is she understands the Tanzanian context, and she works with people in Tanzania, like local people who grew up and live in Tanzania, so that she can execute on the funds and help get the businesses set up. So she's working with people who really understand the culture, really understand the possible pitfalls, and really understand the ways to be successful. And then she just replicates it. And so I think that's the biggest key, is having these on the ground people who really understand the context and are able to execute well.
Right. She's not just shooting over a few $100 from halfway across the world and saying, all right, go in there and start a
Yeah,
business.
have at it. Yeah, exactly. And
Right.
that's what happens most often. That's what is most often happening when when you're hearing about these bad charities, is people are just kind of parachuting money in and hoping something good happens from it, and it never does.
Great. All right. Yeah. So go ahead and give us that other
Oh,
example.
okay. So yeah, that was the grassroots level. That's something that people, like individual people, can do, and it's a huge help to individual people's lives. On a more systematic level, there's lots of opportunities to promote education in these different contexts. And again, like for whatever reason, it seems like educating women creates this like massive, because what happens when you educate a man is he gets educated and that's it. It just stops there. When you educate a woman, supposedly in these contexts, according to the data, when you educate a woman, they learn the information and then they pass it on to their sisters and their moms and their kids. It keeps going and it keeps going. And so I think that education and then specifically girls' education seems to be a great way to bring an entire country up.
So that really changes the culture then, if women are passing these lessons along to their children and their family and their fellow villagers and that sort of thing. That seems like what this is all about. Obviously, helping families, helping people on the small scale is great, but at the end of the day, ultimately, you want these cultures to really change so people know that they can help themselves. Another thing I want to ask is, like, how do the governments of these countries respond? Like you discussed, they're very corrupt. These aren't really capitalist countries in any sense of the word. Do you guys get any resistance to going in and helping people in this way? I mean, do they say some of the politicians in these places who have so much control over the economy, do they feel threatened at all when these guys just from halfway across the world can just roll in and help people like that, whereas they're probably making all sorts of promises out there that they really never deliver on?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's important to remember in these contexts is they actually have a much the government reach in these countries is actually much smaller than in a country like America, right? We've got cops walking up and down the street. We've got an Air Force and Navy and all this stuff. In a place like Malawi or Tanzania or one of these places, the government is just really small and it's like always broke. And then the money that's supposed to go to running the government is often being pocketed by the government officials. And so there's not like people patrolling the streets like there would be in a more affluent place like ourselves. So in a lot of cases, people are being left alone. And so we're able to do good work, but also in a lot of cases, one of the things that the libertarians talk about is you do need private property to be protected. And so because the government isn't as influential, they're not able to protect private property and things like that. And that's just too bad. So there's other ways that people get policed. There's more of like a mob rule that happens and so forth. But yeah, I mean, it's just a totally different context.
So there's not much of a true justice system there in that sense, where if someone acquires property, there's not much of a legal channel to really protect it as much as there might be in a place like the United States.
Oh yeah, the court system. I mean, hiring a lawyer, all that stuff, it would just be foreign to them. Even, I mean, when I was in Malawi, there were a lot of people who, unfortunately, they got accused of a crime, and they were just sitting in jail. They weren't able to defend themselves or have proper due process. So yeah, I mean, the government is both really small and really inefficient and doing the few jobs that it's supposed to do, like having a justice system, like protecting private property. It's encouraging the sovereignty of the individual. Those few jobs, it's not even doing that. And so I think that's another thing where if we could encourage governments to care about some of those values more, I think that would be a big help. But it's tough.
I want to go back and just kind of readdress one of these examples you brought up a little bit earlier about minimum wage. Now, obviously, say a $15 minimum wage in a country like Malawi, where people might be making $1 or $2 a day sometimes, would seem ridiculous. But even on a smaller scale, I mean, just to kind of illustrate the point here, and obviously a principle and a strain of logic is going to apply the same way in any situation. But what would happen if even, say, a $2 an hour minimum wage were instituted in a country like that? To somebody like us, that might seem reasonable. I mean, everyone should be able to make at least $2 an hour to get by. But what would happen if even something like that was implemented in an economy like that?
Yeah, so I mean, and often it is implemented. Those kinds of things are implemented thanks to Western influences. So, like especially factories in China, they do have certain minimum requirements that they're required to do that, and that's often through social pressure because like Nike won't do it because they'll get in big trouble if it's found out that they're not hiring their workers, or whatever. And what happens is that people don't get jobs and they move their they go elsewhere. They go wherever they can to get the work done for the cheapest amount. And the people who don't get jobs, they end up in a really bad situation. I mean, like, I don't know how else to say it. Like, a lot of times they get sick. They have no way of taking care of themselves. They are not able to buy enough food for themselves. The number, yeah, it's there's a lot of really, really negative consequences to implementing these policies when you don't understand the context. And so, yeah, I mean, like a $2 minimum wage in Malawi would be catastrophic. It would like people would not be able to get jobs.
Right, because to justify a $2 an hour wage to somebody, they have to be creating at least that much wealth for the person hiring them, and that's just not realistic in a place like that. So all that's going to happen there is the jobs simply won't exist. Like you said, when the jobs don't exist, in a place like that, the only other options to having those jobs are just having nothing, being
Yeah.
poor,
Mhm.
not eating a certain day, or doing something terrible, having to sell, go send a child into prostitution, or just having to do whatever it takes to survive, which, like you said, are often very, very horrible things that are much worse than working for a lower than would seem reasonable to us wage.
Hmm. And no one is forcing anyone to work these wages. I mean, people are usually clamoring to work for them. I mean, like, they really, really, really want to work for them. I'll give you an example. I'm happy to share this. When I lived in Malawi, we had a guy who we hired to come and clean our house every day. And he was like a full-time worker for us. And my household paid him a little over $100 per month. And for us, that was like, I feel bad paying him so little, right? But for him, he was making 3 times more than the average person around him. Like, he was he would consider himself a wealthy person. He had compared to his neighbors, he had a nice house and so forth. And if someone who heard about that was outraged and they said, "Oh my gosh, that household is only paying this guy $100 a month. Like, they need to at least pay him this much." It's like, well, we can't afford that. Like, we're just like we're these like poor aid workers. We're
Right.
hiring this guy because it's like convenient and it makes sense. But we wouldn't hire someone if it was like 5 times as expensive or whatever it is that people think we should do.
Yeah, if you were forced to pay $500 a month for a cleaner, you just wouldn't have a cleaner, and he wouldn't have a job.
Exactly. And then he will be one of his poor neighbors, which he had many of. And I actually I went to his house one time and I made a video about it, and you can see the difference between his house and everyone else's houses. So yeah, I mean, people, one of the reasons I'm excited to have these conversations about global poverty through here and my podcast and other places I've been is because I think that people are not being helped because they simply don't understand the realities of how these things work. And so the more that we can get the reality out, the better.
All right, Gret. Well, I know that is your mission out there in the world, is to get the reality about these situations out there. You're constantly putting out content, whether it's YouTube videos. I know you have your podcast now, and of course, you're setting a shining example through the DonorSee app. I know there's a lot to plug, but I want to make sure you get a chance to plug everything. So please let everybody out there know how they can not only check out DonorSee if they haven't already, but also how they can possibly invest through WeFunder. And of course, feel free to promote your YouTube channel, your new podcast, the whole deal. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I'll say one of the places you can start is you can go to the Gret Glyer podcast. That's on iTunes, like it's everywhere. And if you want to subscribe to that would be super helpful. I do a lot of talking about global poverty, wealth inequality, all of that stuff. So I'd love to have you there. Also, DonorSee.com is a great place to start if you want to get started with DonorSee. You can start giving to any project, and it's like you could give $1 to a project and still get a video update. So it doesn't matter how much you give, but it's a great place to kind of like get exposure to what else is going on in the world. And then if you are in a position to invest in us, there's a minimum investment that's not unsubstantial. And so, but if you're in a place to invest in us, I would love to have you. And so you can go to wefunder.com/DonorSee.
All right, the great Gret Glyer, always doing amazing work out there. Gret, I know we'll be talking again in the future. I wish you all of the best of luck at everything you're doing. So keep up the great work. Keep on roaring.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Gret.